Hey y'all, how y'all doing? Okay, so I did want to apologize in advance and get very nervous when speaking in front of people. And this is a story I haven't shared with a whole lot of people, so it's difficult for me to tell. But the easiest way for me to tell my story is by explaining the three major phases of my life. The first phase occurred when I was a young kid, and I was essentially going through a breakup with my birth father. I was born into a divided family. My mom and stepdad in one house, and my dad and stepmom in another. Life at my dad's house was scary, and I experienced a considerable amount of mental and physical abuse. But when things were at their worst, I found myself lying in bed at night talking to the sky. At the time, I had no relationship with God, knew nothing about Him, didn't go to church, and had never read the Bible. But somehow, I knew God was in the sky, that I was talking to Him, and that I had His undivided attention. To look back on it now, it's amazing to see how He came to me, and how without knowing anything, I knew it was Him and that I could trust Him. I was around 7 or 8 years old when my birth father decided it was best to stop visitation. And while it ended up being one of the best things that ever happened to me, I was devastated at the time. My own flesh and blood no longer wanting anything to do with me, telling me that I was the problem and did this to myself. It's been about 13 years since I last saw or spoke to my dad. The second phase is when I gave my life to Christ. I was in high school, living your average high school life with my mom and my stepdad, who I now call Dad. My life was relatively normal, and I no longer needed God to get me through each day. I'd done a great job at pretending the past never existed. And for so long, I felt a void. And I assumed that it stemmed from the family that it was no longer around. And the thought of it being a spiritual void never crossed my mind. But the more I ignored the void, the bigger it got, and I became worried that God was disappointed in the life I was living. My 2016 New Year's resolution was to get right with God and make better decisions. And within the first few months of the new year, I befriended Adeline Noble, became a regular church attender, and was baptized that May. The third phase is when I stopped listening to God and began listening to the enemy. Once I came down from my spiritual high and was settled into my new Christian life, I was left with the realization of all that I had lost throughout the years. My friends from high school were disappointed in who I had become and cut me out of their lives. And while my family remained supportive, they didn't understand my faith or the changes I had made for myself. I often questioned the choices I made, thinking if surrendering my life to Christ was the right thing to do, why was everyone so mad at me for it? I began to hate everything about myself and assumed that if I wasn't worthy of man's love, I could never be worthy of God's. I developed a fear of abandonment and started convincing myself that everyone I cared about would eventually leave. I began feeling emotions and remembering situations that I had been suppressing for years, and in 2017, I became severely depressed. I did everything I thought I was supposed to do to make myself feel better. Began journaling, exercised regularly, read my Bible every day, and prayed every night. And while physically I was doing everything right, mentally I had let the devil inside my head, and I was listening to everything he said about me. I stopped seeing my friends because I believed I had none. I started skipping classes because I didn't think I had what it took to succeed. And every night, instead of praying for healing, I began praying that God would take me in my sleep. I became numb and began to search for ways to feel something other than the sadness, which resulted in me traveling down the dangerous path of self-harm. When 2018 arrived, I overloaded my plate with as many distractions as I could find. I would fill all free time with work, was putting my everything into academics, was accepted into Radford's nursing school, and I was ready to be happy again. Over time, the cuts were healed, and I was so lost in the busyness that I had no choice but to ignore the depression that lay just beneath the surface. This past fall arrived, and I unexpectedly hit rock bottom. I had a professor constantly in my ear telling me that I wouldn't make it through school and that people like me weren't strong enough for this profession. The more I listened to her, the worse my grades got, and I became an absolute mess. Instead of sleeping, I would lay in bed, crying with frustration and anxious about everything. I was in so much pain that I was desperate for relief, and I reverted back to self-harm as a way of coping. Once again, I had let the mental demons consume me, and because I had kept my sadness a secret for so long, I was far too embarrassed to ask for help. Eventually, the semester was over, and after 6 months of mental instability and many unfortunate situations, I failed out of nursing school. My reality became unbearable, my risks no longer easy to hide, and the thoughts that filled my head began to scare me. This brings me to the now. I currently live in the unknown, and although I have an idea of where I'll go from here, nothing is for certain. I've had no choice but to talk about my depression, and I'm finally getting the help that I've needed for so long. I didn't want to share my story until I had everything figured out, so I could come up here and tell you all about everything I overcame. But God reminded me that I am not the reason I survived, and I am not the one to be praised. He is. So what better time to share the goodness of God than now, when my life is still a mess, and I'm just now learning to surrender this to Him. During these past few months, I've tried endlessly to push Him away and do this life on my own. But unsurprisingly, He hasn't budged. And while I sat at rock bottom pitying myself, He told me to look up and recognize all the blessings I've been surrounded by for so long. God allowed me to see my parents, who would sacrifice anything to help me achieve my goals. My grandma, who was constantly reminding me of how loved I am. Friends who refused to let me isolate myself. The noble family who makes me laugh until I'm in tears. A dog who has captured my entire heart. The Myers family who have taken me in and loved me as one of their own. And a group of sassy middle and high school youth girls who are living proof that there is still so much good in this world. For years I looked at my childhood and I saw unfairness and heartbreak, but now I see a childhood that was filled with late night conversations and an unbreakable bond with God. I used to look at Radford and see a nursing school I wasn't good enough to complete, but now I see God rescuing me from a place I was deeply unhappy in. I used to look at my high school friends and think about what a great loss they were, but now I look at my college friends and church community and think how it can't get better than this. I used to look at myself and see an unlovable daughter, but now I see the daughter of the Almighty Father who tells me I will always be worth it. It's because of my own selfishness that I spent the last 5 months of 2019 believing the enemy's lies and thinking I was walking this path alone. I want to end my story with a truth that has saved me from making very selfish and stupid decisions. Jesus hasn't forgotten us. John 14:3 tells us, "And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also." Maybe this is something everyone here already knows, and maybe I put it in my story just so I could hear it for myself. But I've learned that surrendering your life to Christ doesn't mean that all your problems will be solved or that life will suddenly become easy, but that our spot in heaven is guaranteed. The trial we face now won't matter in the end, and the heartache we feel today won't always be there tomorrow. The beauty of Christianity isn't that life becomes a fairy tale, but that our afterlife will be worth every trial, tear, and scar we endure. I may be anxious about my future, sad about my past, and lost in my present, but because of Jesus and what He did for me and for all of us on the cross, I know that I am heard, I am loved, I am helped, and